Welcome back to TruthCraft, a channel devoted to pursuing the truth while playing Minecraft. Today, I want to talk some more about arguments for God's existence. And I know I've done a few videos on this already. I have this video and then another video left in this sort of arguments for God's existence series. And then after that, I want to move on to other things. I want to talk a bit more about abortion in church history, and I want to talk about some more philosophical things and historical things. So looking forward to the future, the videos I'm going to produce. If you enjoy my content and benefit from it, I would encourage you to like and subscribe. That always helps get the word out about this channel. So today I want to discuss 4 unique arguments for God's existence. Some of these arguments are common, but not quite as common as some of the other arguments I've discussed, such as the cosmological and ontological arguments. And some of these are pretty unique and uncommon. So we're going to go through these fairly quickly. I'll put them all in the form of a syllogism. A syllogism is basically 3 parts. There's premise 1, premise 2, and then a conclusion that follows from both of those premises. Now, just a disclaimer, these syllogisms are not original to me. Now, before we begin, I want to just say that I don't necessarily agree with all of these arguments. I don't think that all of them work equally well, and some of them might be good overall, but have some issues that need to be worked through. Certainly, I don't think it's possible to say that these prove 100% scientifically the existence of God. It's almost impossible to prove anything 100% scientifically, but I do think that they're suggestive, typically, of a creator, God. So let's begin with the moral argument for God's existence. The syllogism that describes the moral argument for God's existence goes like this. Premise 1. If objective moral values and duties exist, then God exists. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties exist. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. This argument begins with the idea that law is based on a lawgiver. That in order to have law, there needs to be someone who gives that law, a particular authority. Now, when we think about objective moral values and duties, objectivity here requires universality and timelessness. Therefore, the lawgiver, the one who gives the law, must have universal and timeless authority. In other words, if objective moral values and duties do exist, those must come from a lawgiver who is himself objective, that is, universal and timeless, and that is God. Now, some people might deny that there are objective moral values and duties. In fact, some people may simply say that morality is based on society or based on the individual person, so on and so forth. I think you've all heard these different views. But I think we need to consider the implications of this position. Without real authority behind moral imperatives, morals are at best simply an expression of the will of what a particular society or culture or individual thinks is best for them. So take murder, for example. If there is no universal and timeless reason why murder is wrong, then this means there are some places or times when it is permissible or even right. Now, of course, one may think that murder is bad for society, but what if the murderer doesn't care about that? He has no obligation other than his own desire and will, and either way, he will receive no punishment as long as he can escape the punishment of society. So the question is not whether murder is bad for society or whether there are problems that come along with it. It's whether it's truly morally wrong, and that person really is culpable for what they have done. If there is no one who has universal and timeless authority to make laws, that is, God, then Hitler's actions, for example, in World War II, were not evil. They were simply bad for society or bad for particular individuals. Or slavery in the antebellum South was not immoral. It is simply considered wrong by our present-day culture. Those who believe that they can simply do what they think is right and still be moral, regardless of whether they believe in God or not, don't realize that cultures and societies have had different ideas as to what is right and wrong. And if you don't follow God's law, you will simply follow man-made laws. You'll simply follow whatever is popular in your culture at the time, or whatever you want to do. And that is simply not a tenable position, I believe. And it is for this reason that the moral argument has a lot of force behind it, I think. Now let's move on to the next argument, the experiential argument. Premise 1. If there are genuine religious experiences of God, then God exists. Premise 2. There are genuine religious experiences of God. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. Now, obviously, the genuineness of religious experience is difficult to ascertain for ourselves, let alone for other people. Nevertheless, we come to believe many things in our lives based on experience. For example, we learned how to walk by experiencing the use of our legs and also seeing how others do it. And it is for this reason that if we have a religious experience, an experience of God, or something spiritual in our lives, we should not automatically discount that this is really pointing towards something beyond our world, towards something supernatural. So, in other words, I do not think it is contrary to reasonable thought and reasonable people to believe something because we have experienced its power, to believe in God because we've experienced His working in our lives, or we've actually heard His word to us. Thirdly, let's look at the historical argument for God's existence. Now, the historical argument is all about the resurrection of Jesus. It goes like this. Premise 1. If Jesus rose from the dead, then God exists. Premise 2. Jesus rose from the dead. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. Now, premise 1 holds because Jesus himself testified that he would rise from the dead, and the Bible specifically says that God accomplished this. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it, says Peter in Acts. In addition, rising from the dead is something supernatural and must have a supernatural cause. Now, the question, of course, is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Very briefly, here is some historical evidence that scholars point to for the resurrection. Number 1, the empty tomb. Now, this is a fact that could easily have been checked by Christ's contemporaries and the contemporaries of the apostles. Had the tomb still contained Jesus in it, it would have been easy to go simply check the tomb. But that is not ever brought up in any of the sources or by any of those who oppose the resurrection of Christ. Number 2, post-resurrection appearances. Paul, in fact, tells us that he appeared to more than 500 people at one time, and that most of those people were still living in his day. People who could testify to the fact that they saw Jesus alive. That's 500 people and many more, right, including all the apostles and other disciples who saw Jesus alive. So in other words, eyewitness accounts of the resurrection of Christ, something we absolutely should not discount. Number 3, transformation of the disciples. Now, if the disciples fabricated the resurrection of Christ from the dead, it seems very odd that on one day they're mourning and very sad about the loss of their good friend, and just a few days later they have joy in their hearts and they're preaching the gospel message to the people. Furthermore, 11 out of the 12 apostles died for their faith, were martyred, sometimes in brutal ways. So this goes to show that the disciples truly believed what they were saying, and truly believed they had seen the Lord, which they testified to. Number 4, Paul's conversion. Now, Paul's conversion is one of the most radical conversions we see in the whole Bible. Paul originally is a persecutor of the Christians. He absolutely despises them, and he's putting them to death. And the next day, he is confessing Jesus as the Christ, he's baptized, and he's preaching and actually arguing with the other Jews, trying to show them that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. For somebody who is so steeped in Old Testament scriptures, who's so opposed to the Christian message, to be so radically transformed by that is not reasonably explainable by human means. Instead, what Paul testifies to, that Jesus Christ, the risen Christ, met him on the road to Damascus and told him that what he was doing was wrong, is the much better explanation, in fact. And the final piece of evidence I'll point out here is the historical reliability of the New Testament. Scholars have looked at the reliability of the New Testament, especially the book of Acts, which records the events of the early church when they're preaching the gospel just after Christ has risen from the dead and ascended into heaven. And it seems that it's extremely historically reliable in all the different events that it records. And so we have good reason to believe that the people who wrote it are not trying to deceive us, but are trying to speak the truth. The fourth argument we'll talk about today is the pragmatic argument. Now, some might know this as Pascal's wager, but let's take a look at the syllogism here and how this is structured. Premise 1. If believing in God has potentially infinite benefits and not believing in God has potentially infinite losses, then it is rational to believe in God. Premise 2, believing in God has potentially infinite benefits, eternal happiness, and not believing in God has potentially infinite losses, that is, eternal suffering. Conclusion, therefore, it is rational to believe in God. Now, someone might object that consequences for something do not contribute to its rationality, and actually I'm inclined to agree. It might be better to say wise, or at least understandable. That is, it's wise or understandable to believe in God given the potentially infinite benefits and the potentially infinite losses should we fail to believe in God. I think this argument may come into play when someone is totally on the fence about arguments for and against God. It can push someone to be a theist based upon its wisdom. But even then, we have to consider what kind of theist to be, since virtually every religion is exclusive and does not include those of the other religions as those who will end up in paradise. So in some sense, I'm not particularly moved by this final argument, although I definitely understand why some people are. So there you go. Those are 4 unique arguments for God's existence. As I said before, I hope to come out with a final video on arguments for God's existence next week. I'm going to have 10 uncommon arguments for God's existence that I go through very quickly, so make sure you stick around for that. Great to share this time together with you guys today. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.